right now, roughly a fifth of the world's daily oil supply is, floating through a waterway that is just, it's so tense that international shipping companies are basically holding their breath.
Yeah, they really are.
We are, of course, talking about the Strait of Hormuz, and currently, it is just a landscape of plummeting traffic, sudden ship seizures, and these really desperate kind of ad hoc arrangements just to keep, minimal energy flows moving.
Right.
So if you're sitting there wondering why your heating bill fluctuates so wildly, or why the cost of getting a package delivered suddenly spikes out of nowhere, you can basically draw a direct line right back to that tiny, narrow strip of water.
You really can. It's the ultimate global choke point, right?
Yeah.
And what makes the current situation so precarious is that we aren't looking at some peaceful lull in the region right now. Like, we are in a highly, highly dangerous holding pattern.
Right. It's not a resolution.
Exactly. There are, fragile ceasefires in place, sure, but the underlying conflicts, the ones involving Iran, Israel, the U.S., and various regional factions, they are completely unresolved.
Yeah.
It's essentially a geopolitical standoff where, honestly, everyone still has their finger hovering right over the trigger.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are going to unpack a roadmap that, well, it claims to have the solution.
A very ambitious solution.
Extremely ambitious. It is a fascinating, wildly complex, and highly controversial blueprint for a complete political transition in Iran.
Yeah.
And it comes from a May 2026 post on a blog called Barak Face, which the author, interestingly enough, notes right at the top of the post that they were Barack Obama's very first full-time volunteer in New York City.
Right, which gives you a bit of their background.
Exactly. And from a single recent diplomatic headline, this author has spun out this incredibly detailed framework that they are calling a path to lasting peace.
And before we really get into the weeds of the actual mechanics of this blueprint, we definitely need to set some very clear ground rules for this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because the topics we are exploring today are, they're incredibly volatile.
Yeah, to say the least.
Right. They involve actively unfolding crises, deeply entrenched historical wounds, and, intense political maneuvering across the Middle East and the West. So because we're dealing with the internal politics of Iran and the security strategies of nations like the U.S. and Israel, it is absolutely vital to state up front that neither of us is taking a side here.
100%.
We aren't endorsing this specific transition plan. We aren't, validating the author's political leanings or their historical interpretations.
Right. Our goal is strictly analytical today.
Exactly. We are here to basically dismantle the architecture of this proposal, examine how the author believes these levers of power can actually be pulled, and just impartially report on the ideas presented in the material. We want to understand the framework. We are not here to champion it.
Exactly, because whether you are, just exhausted by the endless cycle of headlines about Middle East conflicts, or you're just genuinely curious about how seemingly impossible geopolitical knots get untied in the real world.
This blueprint is, it was a masterclass in theoretical problem solving.
It really is.
It does not pull any punches.
No, it doesn't. And I think to understand the sheer scope of the author's solution, we first kind of have to look at the immediate trigger for it.
Right. The catalyst.
Right. The author zeroes in on this very specific, very recent diplomatic signal from the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi. Araghchi basically publicly acknowledged that the current talks with the U.S. talks that were being brokered by Pakistan are proving, quote, difficult.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because in the world of, high-level international diplomacy, the word difficult is usually polite code for completely stalled or just falling apart entirely.
Yeah, precisely. It means the current back-channel architecture is just failing. Right. So because of this failure, Araghchi is actively pushing for India to step in and take on a much larger mediation role to resolve this West Asia crisis. And when I was reading the author's analysis of this shift moving from Pakistan to India, it immediately made me think of, like, a massive multi-generational family feud.
Oh, that's an interesting angle. How so?
Well, imagine two sides of a family that have been locked in this bitter, destructive dispute for decades, right?
Yeah.
Eventually, the collateral damage gets so bad that they realize, okay, we have to talk. So they bring in a cousin to mediate.
Right.
In this geopolitical scenario, that cousin is Pakistan. But here's the major problem. Pakistan shares a massive, highly porous border with Iran.
Yes, they do.
They have their own incredibly complex history of sectarian tensions, shifting alliances with the West, and, their own regional security concerns. So the baggage is just way too heavy.
Right, the mediator's too close to the drama.
Exactly. Every time that cousin tries to facilitate a conversation, their own historical friction just gets in the way. The mediator basically inadvertently becomes part of the problem.
That accurately captures the severe limitations of the current mediation setup.
Yeah.
And the author points out that a credible transition requires someone who can, navigate the space without immediately triggering those historical tripwires.
Right. So the Iranian foreign minister looks around the international room and basically signals for a different friend. He points to India.
Mm-hmm.
In our family feud analogy, India is the friend who has serious credibility and their own economic investments in the neighborhood. I mean, they actually helped build the massive Chabahar port in Iran.
They did, yeah. It's a huge investment.
Right. But crucially, India lacks the toxic baggage of direct involvement in the specific conflicts of the last 40 years.
Exactly. And the phrase the author uses to describe India's potential role here is a neutral third path.
A neutral third path.
Right. And the mechanics of why that works are really fascinating, because mediation isn't just about, passing notes back and forth between rooms.
Sure.
It is entirely about leverage and trust. If the U.S. and Iran are going to agree to step back from the ledge, they both have to fundamentally believe that the mediator isn't secretly working some angle that compromises their core security.
Right. They need to know it's not a trap.
Exactly. And India possesses this completely unique geopolitical profile. They maintain incredibly strong strategic and technological ties with the United States and Israel.
Mm-hmm.
But at the exact same time, they also have this long, fiercely guarded history of non-aligned foreign policy and very deep economic engagement with Iran.
So they are essentially the pragmatist in the room.
Yes.
They don't have like a deeply ingrained ideological axe to grind in the Middle East. They just want the shipping lanes open and the region stable because they do a massive amount of business there.
Exactly. They bring pragmatic credibility to the table. However, the author is really quick to point out that swapping Pakistan for India as a mediator is ultimately just a procedural adjustment.
Right.
It's like changing the person holding the microphone, but it doesn't actually change the song.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And the underlying reality that the author stresses is that if a permanent political solution isn't found, the alternative is just catastrophic.
Which is the core argument the author builds this entire roadmap upon.
Right.
The text makes a really forceful case that merely pausing the violence, just securing another temporary ceasefire without fundamentally changing how Iran is governed is basically just hitting the snooze button on a bomb.
Yes.
It's just a prelude to the next inevitable round of war.
And the author details exactly what that next round of war would cost.
Yeah, let's really dig into what that means, because this is where geopolitics hits you, the listener, right in the wallet.
Absolutely.
So the Strait of Hormuz is only about, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point?
Roughly, yeah. It's incredibly narrow.
Right. But a staggering amount of the world's liquefied natural gas and oil has to squeeze through that tiny bottleneck every single day.
Yep.
And the author warns that if full-scale war breaks out, we aren't just looking at a few nervous shipping companies rerouting their boats.
No.
We are looking at widespread, deliberate mining of the strait. We are looking at massive naval blockades and direct, sustained military strikes on oil processing facilities.
And the cascading effects of that are they're immediate. The text outlines how this triggers instantaneous massive energy shocks.
Right.
If a fifth of the world's oil is suddenly physically trapped in the Persian Gulf, global manufacturing costs skyrocket, shipping costs quadruple, and worldwide inflation just surges out of control.
Yeah.
Nations that rely heavily on these imports would face severe humanitarian and economic crises almost overnight.
And that is just the external cost.
Exactly.
Inside Iran, the author describes a horrifying internal toll. We're talking about the systematic destruction of the country's infrastructure, total economic isolation, the imposition of complete internet blackouts that basically cut the population off from the entire world.
Right.
And just thousands upon thousands of civilian casualties. Ultimately, the Iranian people are the ones who would bear the ultimate crushing weight of the status quo failing.
Which brings up a really critical debate in international relations that the author actually tackles head on.
Oh, the deterrence argument.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I really wanted to push back on the author here, actually, because the classic conventional wisdom in, Washington or London is usually all about pressure.
Right, maximum pressure.
Yeah. The idea is that if you apply extreme, punishing military and economic pressure to a regime, if you credibly threaten their infrastructure and their actual survival, they will eventually cry uncle.
That's the theory.
Right. Doesn't the threat of absolute devastation force a government to back down?
I mean, it is a logical assumption on paper, but the author strongly argues the exact opposite.
Really?
Yes. The text asserts that under extreme existential pressure, the current establishment in Iran would not abandon its defining features. Its proxy networks across Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq, its advanced ballistic missile programs, its nuclear ambitions, they wouldn't be halted. The author argues they would be violently accelerated.
Wait, but why? Like, if you are clearly losing a fight, why double down on the exact things that are getting you punched in the first place?
Because you have to understand the psychology of the regime as the author frames it.
Okay.
These programs, the proxies, the missiles, the nuclear infrastructure, they are not viewed as bargaining chips by the leadership.
So interesting.
Right. They are viewed as the ultimate non-negotiable mechanisms of survival.
Got it.
If the regime feels its very existence is legitimately threatened by an overwhelming military campaign, they will throw everything they have at the wall.
Yeah, they have nothing to lose.
Exactly. They will perpetuate endless cycles of retaliation because, from their perspective, there is no alternative.
So they basically back into a corner, realize there is no exit door, and just bare their teeth.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the author uses this dynamic to argue that military victories against deeply entrenched regimes are almost always Pyrrhic.
Right.
You might temporarily bomb a missile facility into rubble, sure, but you do not solve the underlying political and ideological drivers that built that facility in the first place.
Yeah, the ideology is still there.
Exactly. You just ensure that the next generation of leadership is even more radicalized and even more determined to rebuild it, just deeper underground.
Wow. So if temporary diplomacy is just this Band-Aid that eventually falls off, and overwhelming military force is a global economic nightmare that actually makes the regime more dangerous long term, we're basically left with this massive void.
Right.
How do you actually fix the root of the problem?
And this is where the roadmap transitions from just analyzing the crisis to proposing a deeply radical structural cure. The author's primary thesis is that the only way out of this cycle is a comprehensive, total political reset.
And this framework is where things get highly specific and, honestly, quite controversial.
Very controversial.
The author argues that before you can build a new, stable Iran, you have to basically initiate a massive institutional demolition.
Right.
The very first step of this framework requires dissolving the existing constitution, dismantling the current parliament, and entirely removing the revolutionary structures of the state.
It is a complete wiping of the institutional slate.
Yeah.
But what is truly fascinating is how the author proposes managing the immediate aftermath of that demolition. Because to prevent total chaos, the text suggests establishing a highly structured interim government.
Right.
And the figurehead they propose for this interim phase is Reza Pahlavi.
Operating as a constitutional monarch.
Correct.
Okay, I have to stop and really challenge this.
Go for it.
Because to a lot of people, dissolving a modern state apparatus to install a constitutional monarch sounds like literally moving backward in time.
Right.
I mean, Reza Pahlavi is the son of the last Shah of Iran, who was famously overthrown in the 1979 revolution.
Yes.
To many people, his family's legacy is deeply, deeply tied to the authoritarianism that caused the revolution in the first place.
Absolutely.
So how does the author justify placing him at the dead center of a roadmap designed to bring Iran into the future?
It is undoubtedly the most glaring question of the entire proposal. And the author's actually quite careful with their wording here.
Okay.
The text explicitly acknowledges that Pahlavi is, quote, not universally embraced.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
Right. The author is not claiming that every Iranian citizen is secretly longing for a return of the monarchy. However, the text argues that Pahlavi possesses a unique and this is their phrase, symbolic resonance for a significant portion of the population.
Symbolic resonance.
Right. And that he has an undeniable growing visibility as an opposition voice.
Okay, so the argument is less about his specific, political genius and more about what he represents, like a thread of continuity to a pre-revolutionary identity.
Exactly. And it is absolutely crucial to focus on the word constitutional in the author's proposal.
Right, he's not an absolute dictator.
No. The framework does not suggest restoring an absolute monarchy where Pahlavi holds total executive power.
Mm-hmm.
He is positioned purely as a unifying symbolic figurehead for an interim period.
Got it.
Think of the role more along the lines of the monarchies in the UK or Japan.
Yeah.
A stabilizing national symbol. Well, the actual day-to-day mechanics of governance are handled by elected officials.
Okay, and the mechanics of that governance are really where the author's pragmatism shines through, I think.
Definitely.
Because Pahlavi wouldn't be running the country alone, obviously. The text outlines a very specific design for his interim cabinet.
Yes.
It's essentially this wild geopolitical balancing act. The cabinet would draw on diaspora expertise, Iranians who have been living abroad for decades, building massive expertise in economics, law, international relations.
Right.
It would also include fierce domestic critics of the current system who have been advocating for human rights from within. But here is the part that really, really caught my eye.
What's that?
It would actively include pragmatic figures from the current regime.
Yes. And the author specifically names Abbas Araghchi. The current foreign minister who we mentioned was asking India for help as exactly the type of figure who needs to be in this new cabinet.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive.
It really does at first glance.
I mean, if you are organizing a revolution to overthrow a government, why on earth would you give the current foreign minister a desk in the new office?
Right. But it's because of the harsh, unforgiving realities of statecraft and transition dynamics.
Okay.
If we look at historical examples of regime change, the absolute most dangerous moment is the morning after the old government falls.
Sure.
If you engage in a total purge, if you fire every single bureaucrat, every general, every administrator associated with the old system, you create an immediate, massive power vacuum.
And power vacuums usually get filled by the most violent guys with the most guns.
Almost without fail. The water stops running, the banks close, the borders are undefended, and society just collapses into insurgency.
Wow.
So the author is proposing a meticulously managed transition. By bringing in pragmatic elements of the current establishment, you keep the plumbing of the state working.
Right, you need the infrastructure to hold up.
Exactly. You ensure the traffic lights still change and the hospitals still get funded. But more importantly, from a strategic perspective, you fundamentally alter their incentives.
Or so.
Well, if you offer the current power brokers a soft landing and a legitimate role in the future of the country, they are far less likely to fight to the bitter end.
Oh, I see. You essentially say, look, the house is coming down.
Right.
You can either stay inside and get crushed, or you can step outside, help us draw the blueprints for the new house, and we'll guarantee you a room in it.
That is the exact transactional logic. You dismantle the resistance from within by giving them an out. And then Pahlavi would select an interim prime minister to run the actual day-to-day operations of the state while a new interim constitution is immediately promulgated.
And the text is very clear on what that interim constitution must include on day one.
Yes, it is.
It legally enshrines core human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to peaceful assembly.
Essential pillars.
But it also emphasizes something else that I think is uniquely vital for Iran specifically, and that is federalism?
Yes. Federalism is a crucial component of this roadmap.
Yeah.
Because Iran is not a monolith. It is an incredibly diverse nation with significant populations of Kurds, Balochs, Arabs, and Azeris, many of whom have faced, severe marginalization for decades.
Right.
By embedding federalism into the interim constitution, the new government immediately signals to these diverse regions that they will have real local autonomy and a genuine voice in the new system.
So it builds trust immediately.
Exactly. It provides instant legitimacy, and crucially, it prevents the country from splintering along ethnic lines during what is going to be a very fragile transition.
Okay, so on paper, this looks brilliant, right?
Sure.
You have a unifying figurehead, you have a coalition cabinet that keeps the state running, and a constitution guaranteeing rights and regional autonomy.
Right.
But let's be fiercely realistic here for a second.
Okay.
Changing the laws and replacing the guys in suits at the top is, honestly, the easy part.
It is.
How do you actually dismantle the physical, deeply entrenched power structures that enforce the old system. Because the military apparatus doesn't just, hand over their weapons and their bank accounts just because someone signed a new piece of paper in the Capitol.
No, they absolutely do not. And the author is keenly aware of this massive hurdle.
Okay.
To neutralize a deeply entrenched military apparatus like this, you cannot just fight them in the streets. You have to attack their foundation.
Right.
You have to go after their money.
And here is where the roadmap introduces what I honestly think is its most fascinating and, frankly, its most unexpected strategy.
Yeah, this part is brilliant.
The author uses a deeply specific corporate analogy from American history to explain how to disarm a Middle Eastern military force.
It's why.
They propose a massive economic restructuring specifically aimed at the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC.
And it is really essential to understand how the author characterizes the IRGC here.
Right.
Because they are not merely an elite branch of the military.
No.
The text describes them as controlling a vast economic empire.
Yeah.
Over the decades, the IRGC has basically embedded itself into almost every lucrative sector of the Iranian economy. They control massive construction conglomerates, telecommunications networks, energy infrastructure, and, crucial import-export pipelines.
They are essentially a heavily armed, state-sponsored corporate monopoly.
Exactly.
And the author's solution to this is to execute an AT&T-style divestiture.
It is a brilliant, highly illustrative comparison.
For those listening who might not be familiar with American corporate history from the 1980s, AT&T used to be an absolute, untouchable behemoth of a monopoly.
They owned everything.
Literally. They owned the physical phone lines in the ground, they manufactured the actual telephones in your house, and they controlled the service.
Right.
The U.S. government eventually stepped in and basically said, this is way too much concentrated power, and forced AT&T to break apart into smaller, independent, regional companies that became known as the Baby Bells.
Yep.
The author of this roadmap is suggesting that we take this exact corporate legal strategy and apply it to a literal military organization.
Right. Let's break down exactly how the author envisions this working in practice.
Please do.
Because the strategy is to surgically separate the IRGC's legitimate military functions from its sprawling commercial empire.
Okay.
So you take all those construction companies, the telecom holdings, the energy contracts, and you forcefully spin them off into completely independent commercial units.
You essentially rip the corporate checkbook right out of the general's hands.
Exactly.
But what actually happens to those new independent companies once they're spun off?
Well, the text proposes opening them up to a massive wave of both foreign and domestic investment.
Okay.
The ownership structure of these newly spun-off entities would be deliberately fractured. The author suggests dividing the shares, essentially.
How so?
Well, a significant portion would be held by the state to generate revenue on behalf of the Iranian people. Another large chunk would be sold to foreign corporate partners, and the rest would be made available to private Iranian investors.
I have to pause here, though.
Sure.
Because initiating a massive Wall Street-style corporate restructuring in the dead middle of a political revolution sounds insanely complicated.
It sounds chaotic.
Right. Why go through this incredibly dense accounting exercise? Why not just, I don't know, seize the assets and shut them down completely?
Because seizing them just transfers the monopoly to the new government, which immediately breeds corruption.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. By breaking them up and selling off the shares, the author argues you fundamentally demilitarize the economy. And this achieves three monumental things simultaneously.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, it completely shatters the monopoly, which suddenly opens up immense financial opportunities for regular Iranian entrepreneurs and international businesses who were, previously locked out of those wickets entirely.
Right. It creates a real free market.
Exactly. Second, it instantly forces the Iranian economy to integrate with the global market.
And the third achievement, because this is the one that really impacts global security, right?
Yes. The third and arguably the most critical point is that it fundamentally alters the financial incentives for military adventurism.
Okay, explain that.
Think about how a closed military economic loop actually works.
Right.
If your power relies on illicit trade networks, smuggling, and, state-sanctioned monopolies that don't ever have to compete fairly, you actually benefit from your country being isolated.
Oh, wow.
You benefit from conflict
Yeah.
because it keeps the international competition out.
So war is actually good for their specific business model.
Exactly. But if you take those massive assets and spin them off, so they are now owned by international shareholders, foreign pension funds, and private citizens, suddenly, starting a war is catastrophic for business.
Right.
If your telecom company relies on foreign microchips, or your construction firm is partnered with a European engineering conglomerate, you are deeply incentivized to maintain international stability.
If your money is tied up in global commerce, you don't want the shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz closed.
No, you want them wide open.
Exactly. You are literally using capitalism as a golden handcuff. You are forcibly aligning their financial interests with peace instead of conflict.
That is the underlying genius of applying the AT&T divestiture model to a military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
You neutralize the economic engine of war by turning it into a series of regular, boring, profit-driven corporations that desperately need stability to survive.
Okay, I love the elegance of that corporate strategy. It's brilliant.
It is.
But even if you successfully restructure their entire economy, you still have massive glaring issues left on the table.
Oh, of course.
You still have the actual physical military hardware, the advanced centrifuges, the ballistic missiles, and perhaps even more challenging, you have a deeply, deeply traumatized society.
Right.
You cannot just hand out stock options, write a new constitution, and pretend the human rights abuses of the past 4 decades never happened.
No, the author is very clear-eyed about this. And that leads directly into the next critical phases of their roadmap, which focus heavily on establishing justice internally and security externally.
Let's look at how the author tackles the internal wounds first, because the text calls for the immediate formation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yes, and this is a mechanism that has been used in places like, post-apartheid South Africa or post-conflict Rwanda. The stated goal in this roadmap is to aggressively prosecute the absolute worst offenders of the previous system, the major architects of human rights abuses, while explicitly offering a path to rehabilitation and amnesty for the lower-level individuals who simply followed orders or were, just caught up in the system.
And the author notes that this specific balance is vital to prevent society from falling into, quote, cycles of revenge.
Exactly.
Because when a regime falls, the immediate public impulse is often a bloody, uncontrolled purge.
Right.
But if every single person who ever worked for the old government fears they will be executed or imprisoned, they will just form an insurgency and fight to the death.
They had to.
Right. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission provides a pressure valve. It establishes an undeniable historical record of the abuses. It provides a sense of closure and justice for the victims. But it does so in a structured, legal way that prevents the new government from being paralyzed by endless tribunals.
It allows the society to collectively process the trauma and then basically agree to move forward. Meanwhile, on the external front, the author demands a sweeping, immediate freeze on all activities that threaten international security.
Okay.
The text dictates that Iran's nuclear enrichment programs, its ballistic missile development, and all of its financial and logistical support for proxy networks across the region must be halted instantly.
And they can't just promise to stop, right? The author says these programs must be placed under strict international supervision with neutral observers.
Right, and this is the massive, non-negotiable concession required to get the United States, Israel, and the Gulf states to actually support this transition.
Right, they need verifiable proof.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the author explicitly notes that this immediate freeze builds confidence and buys time.
Buys time for what exactly?
For the absolute culmination of the transition framework.
Yeah.
The text outlines that everything we just discussed, installing the interim monarch, the complex AT&T breakup of the Revolutionary Guards economy, launching the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and freezing a highly advanced nuclear program, all of this is designed to pave the way for holding nationwide elections for a constituent assembly within exactly 12 months.
Okay, stop. Stop the tape. I have to push back incredibly hard on this.
I expected you might.
I mean, the author's proposing that a country dissolves its entire government,
Right.
installs a controversial interim monarch, executes a Wall Street-level divestiture of a massive military monopoly, prosecutes decades of human rights offenders, rehabilitates a traumatized society, perfectly freezes a sprawling nuclear infrastructure, brings in teams of international observers,
And organizes elections.
and she manages to organize free, fair, democratic elections across a massive, diverse nation, all in 365 days.
Not a lot.
That doesn't just sound ambitious. That sounds like a utopian spreadsheet completely disconnected from reality. I mean, it takes local bureaucracies 12 months just to approve the paperwork to fill a pothole. Is the author being remotely realistic here?
Look, your skepticism is entirely justified. And I really don't think any political scientist reading this text would deny the staggering, almost unimaginable aggression of that 12-month timeline.
It's crazy.
But to understand why the author insists on it, we have to look closely at that phrase you asked about earlier, buys time.
Okay.
The author is not naive enough to believe that every single societal trauma will be perfectly healed or every corporate share perfectly allocated in 1 year.
Then what is the point of the deadline? Why 12 months?
The logic is entirely about momentum.
Momentum.
Yes. In the history of political transitions, time is almost always the enemy of progress.
Oh, interesting.
If an unelected interim government lingers in power for 3, 4, or 5 years without securing a democratic mandate, it inevitably loses its legitimacy in the eyes of the public.
Right. People start asking why they traded one dictator for a committee of dictators.
Exactly. The initial unity of the revolution splinters into competing factions. The remnants of the old guard use that extended time to regroup and sabotage the economy.
Yeah.
The public gets exhausted and disillusioned. So the author's 12-month clock is designed to force a frantic, irreversible sprint.
I see.
It creates such intense, undeniable momentum that the transition simply cannot stall out and fail. It forces every domestic and international player to the negotiating table immediately, because the train is leaving the station whether they are ready or not.
It's essentially shock therapy for state building.
That is a very good way to frame it.
Yeah.
And once that 12-month sprint is over and that Constituent Assembly is finally elected, the text states that this new, democratically legitimate government, a government that genuinely represents the will of the Iranian people, is the entity that will sit down and negotiate the final, permanent, legally binding treaties regarding the nuclear issue and regional security directly with the U.S., Israel, and the international community.
Okay, so the entire 12-month period is essentially just triage. It's about getting the patient stable enough and the vital signs strong enough to survive the actual permanent surgery.
That perfectly encapsulates the author's pacing strategy, yes.
But this brings us to the most fundamental, baseline question of human behavior in this entire roadmap.
Okay, what's that?
We have outlined this incredibly precarious, rapid tightrope walk, right?
Right.
But why would anyone actually agree to step onto the tightrope in the first place?
Yeah.
Why would the current Iranian establishment, even the pragmatic ones we discussed, agree to willingly dismantle their own power structures? And why would the international community, who has been burned by failed Middle East peace plans for decades, trust this process?
Because the author does not rely purely on goodwill, shared values, or, the kindness of politicians' hearts.
Thank goodness.
Right. The author relies on massive, undeniable economic incentives.
Which takes us to the grand finale of the author's argument, the so what for the global stage. The text argues that this incredibly complex, fragile approach ultimately serves the vital interests of every single party involved. But to get them to agree, the plan hinges on one massive, juicy carrot being dangled in front of the Iranian public.
The text states this explicitly. Quote, "Crucially, sanctions relief should take effect as soon as the interim authority under Pahlavi assumes power."
All right, let's make sure we really emphasize the timing there.
Right.
The author is not saying sanctions are lifted after the 12 months are up.
No.
They aren't lifted after the democratic elections are certified. They are lifted on day one.
Day one. The absolute moment the interim government is sworn in, the economic gates must swing open.
Wow.
And the author explains the mechanics of why this is an absolute necessity. The text argues this is required to provide, quote, tangible dividends to the Iranian people and incentivizing cooperation.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about the psychology of a population in transition, right? If the average citizen risks their life to support a political reset, but 6 months later they still can't afford bread, inflation is still at 50%, and they still can't get basic medicine because of international banking sanctions. They will turn on the interim government immediately.
Exactly. The revolution will just consume itself.
Right. The author understands that for the new government to survive that insane 12-month sprint, the people have to physically feel their lives improving on a daily basis.
They need to see foreign ships docking in their ports, international businesses opening offices, and their currency stabilizing immediately.
Yeah.
That is the only way to maintain the massive public buy-in necessary to keep the transition moving forward.
So, if the sanctions lift on day one, let's systematically walk through the global winners in this scenario, exactly as the text outlines them.
Sure.
Because the author makes a really compelling case that this is a rare win-win-win for the entire international community.
It really is framed that way.
First, the primary stakeholder is the Iranian people.
For Iranians, the text is completely unequivocal. This roadmap offers the return of human dignity, legally enshrined civil rights, and explosive economic prosperity after decades of crippling isolation and internal repression.
All right.
The author points to widespread polling data and decades of street protests as undeniable proof of a massive, pent-up public desire for this exact kind of integration and change.
Second on the list of winners, Israel and the United States.
Right. From their security perspective, they gain immediate verifiable constraints on what they consider their most existential regional threats. The nuclear program is frozen under international eyes, and the proxy networks are defunded. And crucially, they achieve this massive strategic victory without having to fire a single shot or launch some trillion-dollar military invasion.
Right, which is huge. Third global markets and the Gulf states.
They gain the one thing markets crave above absolutely all else, which is long-term stability.
Yes.
Specifically, the text highlights that this transition ensures the full, unthreatened reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. This restores the reliable flow of global energy and permanently removes the constant looming threat of massive supply shocks that absolutely terrify international investors.
And fourth, India, and frankly, any other nations that step up to mediate.
They massively enhance their diplomatic stature on the world stage.
Right.
By successfully navigating this transition, they prove their capability as highly effective, neutral, pragmatic peacemakers, which of course translates into massive geopolitical influence and future economic partnerships down the line.
And I want to bring this right back to you, the listener, to kind of tie all of these massive global concepts together.
It's important to ground it.
Yeah. We started this deep dive by talking about the incredibly murky, frustrating diagnostic waters of geopolitics. It often feels like these conflicts happen in a vacuum thousands of miles away. But this breakdown of the winners is exactly why whether you are sitting in traffic, commuting to work right now, or you're planning a family budget, or you're just looking at your monthly utility bill, you are tied directly to the success or failure of frameworks just like this one.
Absolutely.
The author describes the reopening of that narrow strait as restoring a global energy lifeline.
Yeah.
When that lifeline is choked by proxy wars and naval standoffs, you pay the price at the pump and at the grocery store.
Exactly.
When it flows freely and predictably, your cost of living stabilizes. The author is ultimately arguing that engineering a safe, structured political transition in Iran is not merely a regional human rights imperative, it is a foundational necessity for global economic health.
Which is precisely why the author concludes their massive blueprint on a surprisingly grounded, realistic note.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Despite the grand, sweeping vision of spinning off military conglomerates and rewriting constitutions in 12 months, the text acknowledges the sheer difficulty of reality. The author writes, quote, "No plan is perfect. Success hinges on broad Iranian ownership rather than imposition."
That is a very crucial distinction.
It is. The international community, the U.S., India, the UN, they can offer the structural framework.
Right.
They can provide the mediation, they can send the observers, and they can offer the massive incentive of instant sanctions relief. But they cannot force the change.
Right. It has to come from within.
The transition, if it is to last, has to be authentically owned, driven, and maintained by the people inside the country.
And what is the author's final bottom line argument to those who might read this entire blueprint and say, you know what, it's simply too risky or too complicated to even try?
The author states that you have to compare this roadmap to the realistic alternatives.
Okay.
And the text lists those alternatives very clearly. A prolonged, bleeding stalemate.
Right.
The sudden, chaotic collapse of the regime into a violent, multi-faction civil war. Or a destructive, full-scale regional war that shuts down the global economy.
None of which are good.
Right. Compared to those options, this structured, incentivized transition is presented as the only logical path that minimizes bloodshed and maximizes the chance of a stable, globally integrated Iran.
Wow.
As the text starkly warns, the alternative to trying this is just, quote, more rubble, higher oil prices, and deferred problems.
More rubble, higher oil prices, and deferred problems. That is an incredibly sobering, razor-sharp summary of the current status quo.
It really is.
So let's take a collective breath and briefly retrace the massive journey this roadmap has taken us on today.
It's been quite a ride.
We started by looking at a single, telling diplomatic signal, Foreign Minister Araghchi's admission that the current mediation was failing, and his plea for a neutral player like India to step in.
Right. And from there, we examine the author's stark warning about the terrifying cascading global costs if diplomacy fails and a renewed war chokes off the Strait of Hormuz.
Then we explore the radical heart of the proposal, right? The controlled demolition of the current state, replaced by an interim government led by Reza Pahlavi.
With that deeply pragmatic cabinet.
Exactly. A cabinet that forces opposition figures and current regime pragmatists to actually work together to keep the lights on.
And then we analyze the fascinating corporate-style strategy of using an AT&T divestiture model to permanently strip the Revolutionary Guard of their vast economic empire.
Right, using capitalism to align their interests with peace.
Exactly.
And finally, we looked at the breathless, seemingly impossible 12-month sprint, a sprint that requires a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a perfectly frozen nuclear program, and the massive instant reward of day one sanctions relief, all culminating in democratic elections.
Yeah.
It is a roadmap that demands an almost unimaginable level of coordination, pragmatism, and, honestly, leaps of faith from every single player on the geopolitical board.
It truly is.
Yeah.
And as we conclude our analysis of this remarkable source material, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought to ponder.
Okay.
A question that builds on the intricate framework we've just spent all this time dismantling, but challenges one of its most fundamental assumptions.
Let's hear it.
The author confidently states that executing a political and economic solution like this promises a final end to this chapter and a better beginning for the next.
Right.
But if we look incredibly closely at the mechanism of breaking up the Revolutionary Guard's vast economic empire,
Okay.
when a nation's military apparatus and its core economic engines are so deeply, intrinsically intertwined over the course of multiple generations, can you truly sever them with a neat corporate divestiture strategy?
Oh, wow.
You can change the corporate structure, sure. You can sell off the shares and bring in foreign investors. But does history suggest that deeply rooted institutional power doesn't actually disappear when you simply change the logo on the building?
Does it just reorganize?
Right. Does it rebrand itself and just find a new, quieter way to pull the strings in the dark?
Wow. That is a question that completely changes how you look at the entire blueprint.
It's worth thinking about.
It is a stark reminder that even when a roadmap looks flawlessly engineered, logically sound, and perfectly balanced on paper, the messy, unpredictable, muddy waters of human history always have a way of seeping back in.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep, expansive dive into the Barak-faced blueprint for Iran. We hope this gave you a new lens to view the region. Stay curious, keep looking past the surface of the daily headlines, and we will see you next time.